So, welcome everyone to the latest in a series of the ISNGI Stepping Stone webinars. And as I've just said, this is being recorded. We're joined today by Professor Rachel Cooper, OBE, and Professor Nick Dunn, who will be speaking about their book, Designing Future Cities for Wellbeing. Rachel Cooper is Distinguished Professor of Design Management and Policy at Lancaster University. She is Director of Imagination Lancaster, an open and exploratory design-led research centre conducting applied and theoretical research into people, products, places, and their interactions. And she is also Chair of the Lancaster Institute for the Contemporary Arts. Professor Cooper's research interests cover design thinking, design management, and design policy, with a specific interest in design for well-being and socially responsible design. She was founding editor of the Design Journal and also founding president of the European Academy of Design, and she's currently president of the Design Research Society. Nick Dunn is executive director of Imagination Lancaster, where he's also chair of urban design. He is a senior fellow for the Institute for Social Futures, where he also leads research in the future of cities and urbanism. His work responds to the contemporary city as a series of systems, flows, and processes, and is explored through experimentation and discourse addressing the nature of urban space, its perception, demarcation, and appropriation. His work contributes to the wider discourse surrounding the current characteristics and potential future scenarios of the urban landscape in a range of contexts. In particular, he's interested in why and how, and maybe even where and when we design, rather than what we design. Professors Cooper and Dunn will be speaking today about their book, Designing Future Cities for Wellbeing, which draws on original research that brings together dimensions of cities we know have a bearing on our health and well-being, including transportation, housing, energy, and foodways, and illustrates the role of design in creating cities that can enhance our health and well-being. Rachel and Nick will explore these interconnecting dimensions and the way in which we think about and design cities for future generations' health and well-being. Finally, I wish to acknowledge Dr. Christopher Boyko, who's been unable to join us today, but who co-edited the book and helped organise this webinar. Rachel and Nick, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I always get fazed by a long introduction like that about us. Anyway, so here we are. Nick and I are going to talk about designing future cities for well-being, and drawing from our book, but also from our particular stance. We are I'm a designer, Nick's a designer and architect, so we're not engineers, and we have a particular slant on the way we look at cities, particularly cities for well-being. So Nick, can you take it forward? Thank you. So what we're going to talk about today is what we mean by well-being, how we design for millions of individuals, what we mean by people in this space, place, services and products, and how we actually think about future cities by design. What does that mean? What are the attributes we need to think about, etc. So next one. Right, okay. Now, so what do we mean by well-being? Doing well refers to certain standards, certain material standards of living or economic prosperity, so doing well. Feeling good involves our personal and subjective perceptions of levels of satisfaction, feeling good about the world, etc. Doing good is much more related to the collective, the shared understanding of how we and the world should be. And feeling well stresses the significance of health to that well-being that we feel. So White's definition is both subjective and objective. It contains dimensions which are personal but also collective notions of well-being. It also includes the specific link between the functioning link with health. Now, it also indicates the fact that well-being is not static, it's dynamic. It allows people to assess, compare how they're doing today with how they were doing yesterday, but also it enables them to think about what they want to achieve in terms of future well-being. So how do we assess our well-being in a later point in life? where do we want to go, what do we want to achieve. And understanding these subtleties of well-being is key to how we think about future cities, how we design future cities, how we support people in urban areas to flourish. Using well-being as a lens enables us to critique and interrogate what we currently know about cities and apply this to how we design future cities. So how we do that is critically important. Next slide, please, Nick. Okay, So in thinking about this, we need to think about the fact that we are, at the moment, it seems, and the evidence shows that we are simply designing cities to cope with demand, rather than actively and consciously improving well-being and quality of life for people. A lot of people believe we're attempting to design cities for the future, to design cities to improve well-being and quality of life. But actually, most of the research that we've done and most cities are just trying to cope with the current demand and have difficulty in thinking about the city of the future. A few cities are doing this, a few cities are leading on this, and they're trying to take long-term approaches. However, well-being is a significant issue when it comes to measuring. There's a huge range of variables. Chris Boyko and I did a study quite a while ago of all the well-being measures, and we came across 2,000 different measures of well-being. And so what you measure and how you measure and when you measure it is quite important, but also the underlying systems of tax, of governance, and other context-specific issues means that actually measuring well-being is not straightforward. And so cities, it's difficult to identify exemplar cities and easily compare those cities. I'm currently doing some work on something called the Oxford Commission for Creating Healthy Cities, working with the UK Prince's Trust and Oxford University and Lord Richard Best in the House of Lords. And we have been working with a couple of UK cities, looking at what data they want to collect, how they want to collect it, and how they can make decisions on using that to make policy, to design and develop their cities. And indeed, in just looking at two cities, they had completely different ways of approaching the data they wanted to use for well-being. There was one common factor, I think, that in both cities that we looked at, and that was inequalities, health inequalities, how those could be improved, where there was a range of problems. So it is possible to compare, but most cities have different problems they want to deal with. Anyway, whatever the complexities, the next generation of young people are calling us to task. We know that the action must be taken now, and in a way that helps us save both humanity and the planet. So well-being is not just well-being of people, it's well-being of the planet. And it's not just well-being of this city or that city or your city, it's well-being of everybody. So we have to think of our neighbours locally, our neighbours nationally, and our neighbours globally. We have to think and consider worldwide how we live and what legacy we are building to enable our future generations to flourish. So designing places that are prosperous, sustainable, resilient, livable, and healthy over the long term is incredibly challenging. It is a massive task, and not least since cities are collectives of individuals with different aspirations and values which compete with one another. How do we design for millions of individuals? This is, for architects and designers, urban planners and engineers, a significant task. I'm going to hand over now to Nick to talk about designing for future cities.
Thanks, Rachel. So I would say there's two key challenges here. And the first is, it's important to understand what we mean by a future city. The diversity of urban environments around the world suggests the current way in which this terminology is applied doesn't really account for all the different differences of cities around the world. And so being able to better understand the granularity of future cities is crucial. The second challenge concerns our ability to explore futures, especially radical ones that may appear very different from existing path dependencies. Most people are not very comfortable with imagining alternative futures, yet many do when they are planning new infrastructure that can have significant impacts on the environment and the people that use it or are also excluded from it. So in order to develop more holistic and appropriate solutions, the design of places must address the future through multiple lenses. I guess to a certain extent, professional designers are trained to do this. But when creating places, we all have the potential to shape urban life. Many people who have an influence on how a city looks and functions are often brought together by accident rather than on purpose. They include elected leaders, government officials, local people in business, the public, cultural and leisure services, and local residents, of course, of all ages and social status. It's this collective that must work together in partnership to design our cities for future well-being. What you can see here is a survey of many, many visions that was conducted by myself and a couple of colleagues at Imagination Lancaster, trying to understand the different ways that we've thought about the future. But at its heart, a city needs people to interact with each other, to improve connections, to ease separations and help create a sense of society, ways of belonging that generate well-being. So the first principle is to recognise the human dimension of city living. This is central to designing for people. But this understanding is dynamic. There's an ongoing need to keep building and connecting evidence bases, many of which still remain in silos. We must examine how aspirations, whether they are connection to nature, sense of community and safety and so forth, can be translated into design principles. But we must also recognise the differences of aspirations that are unique and not necessarily transferable. The design perspective must be one of designing for the entire life course, antenatal right the way through to death. But unfortunately, much of the evidence base currently exists on research in middle and high income countries as opposed to developing countries. So it means that the conclusions are not necessarily applicable. So clearly more work to be done. We've also got to understand design for behaviour change, the intentional and unintentional consequences of design and their complex interdependencies. And this leads us to the issue of designing for the future. Rigorously understanding the interdependencies of people in a complex system, behaviour change and the impact of technological, social, environmental and economic change demand a major step change in the way we approach the design of cities. There is no shortage of guidance on how to design places. In fact, place-based strategies are increasingly gaining headlines again. And this is the natural habitat for the professional designer. In terms of well-being, however, it's really important to focus on people and their relationship to place, or multiple relationships to place. We know cities are places where we can enhance social and psychological well-being. And this is often engendered by the aesthetic quality of the place, the buildings, the spaces between and around. And we know that the incorporation of green spaces in urban environments enhances well-being. But as well as that, we've got to go beyond urban form and we need to reposition this in policy and practice. So the scope for interventions aimed at ending homelessness, reducing housing instability, is much wider than residential urban design and planning approaches can currently provide. So using design to redesign housing policy in relation to built form will be a really critical part of shaping and supporting well-being in future cities. Cities are social spaces, spaces of what we call collective effervescence. Much of this occurs on the street, but also in third spaces distinct from home or work. So active pavements, sidewalks where people socialise outside of these contexts can really help nurture a sense of social connectedness and trust between city residents. The role of weak ties in supporting positive social connections and the geographic scale of their significance obviously varies from city to city. So we require suitable analyses to be conducted to identify those design factors that stimulate that interaction and create a lively urban atmosphere. Overall, understanding the nature of interpersonal interaction is key and needs more attention than it is being given at present, as it has implications that go far beyond the technological fixes of smart city approaches that seem to dominate a great deal of current research, but don't easily accommodate urban ambiances that are the result of complex social interrelationships. Designing services and products are interdependent with the design of the urban environment and infrastructure, even more so as we move through the 21st century. In the sphere of design, there is a need to raise awareness of urban issues and their impacts on health and well-being. For example, research and practice needs to highlight the interdependencies between home design, energy consumption, health, improvement, and education attainment and independence in old age. Raising awareness of where decisions are made, as it's central or local government, private sector, third sector, residents' organisations, can help influence how we design products and services to achieve the desired increase in well-being. There's no ideal solution here, no one size fits all. So essential to this process is a better understanding of the impacts of urban life that are not necessarily obvious in the immediate context of the city, but are perhaps offshored to areas remote from it, such as the labour and materials needed to provide these services and products to people in cities. Current trends and innovations such as artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, wearable technologies, intelligent products and smart cities, they might in the near future deeply affect our experience of and our expectations from the city in the future. It's plausible that these technologies will allow for larger levels of customization, adaptability, and interactivity within the environment, which might generate not only positive well-being outcomes, but also unexpected negative ones, as well as a risk of greater inequalities. Core issues of accessibility, ethics, privacy, trust, and security will drive the comparative adoption of these new technologies and their application. Understanding who is able to utilize these and who is also excluded and why will be key to designing ways to support wider inclusion in future cities as a shared and equitable resource for all. So I'm now going to hand back over to Rachel.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so let's come back to what in reality we need to think about, what we need to do. Everybody thinks that, you know, the pandemic has changed everything and we need to think differently. Well, actually, in research that I've done over 20 years and we've done as a group, we found that there are basically 3 factors, or you could call them design principles, that we need to really think about when we're designing future cities. The first factor is, of course, the quality of the fabric of the physical environment. You know, housing that needs repair, graffiti, rubbish, vandalism, the lack of spaces for play areas, the whole design, construction and maintenance of buildings and spaces and the spaces between them. We have to think about that environment, and that is a key issue for architects and designers and planners going forward, and engineers. The other one, of course, is the quality of the ambient environment, the lighting, the noise, the acoustics, the thermal quality and air quality, and now I'd say the digital quality. what sort of ambient environment are we going to log into? What assets and what interesting offers is that going to bring to people, both from their sense of safety, of fitness, of accessibility, etc. And the third one is the psychological impacts of the physical environment and ambient environment. So people feeling safe, people feeling able to move around, people having private spaces, people being able to play inside and outside, and all the other factors that affect our sense of well-being. Now, of course, the pandemic, in fact, has highlighted this. It's highlighted people's sense of what's crowded, where they had to work from home, their sense of privacy, their ability to have access to spaces. So these three factors are still key to designing future cities. So they're their underlying principles. But going, next slide, please. So I did some work, I think it says there, the paper was 2011, looking at the role of design directly in our health. And this sort of model illustrates that when we design an environment, we're designing a quality of life, and that affects our lifestyle. And pre-pandemic, the biggest issue for most urban areas around the world, both developed, global north, global south, was non-communicable diseases. Non-communicable diseases were going to cost all health services the biggest cost than any other. So when we thought about lifestyle, it was always about the factors in our lifestyle that contribute to non-communicable diseases, heart disease, diabetes, cancer, lung disease, depression. And these were all related to alcohol, nutrition, activity, tobacco. So density was a big issue. And what I mean by that is density of, say, fast food shops, so fast food, or whether there's access to fresh food and so on. And this is still a factor, how people access the best, but also how they access and buy the worst type of nutrition, and what they consume is affected by the way we design places. And so density is critical there. Now, post-pandemic, of course, we've all started to be aware of infection transmission. And at the start, well, in the middle of the pandemic, I started to look at the literature around density. Was density a factor in infection transmission? In fact, most of the studies, a lot of them done in North America, some in Australia and the UK and Europe, identified that density in itself was not a problem. It was crowding. It was crowding and lack of ventilation that was was increased infection transmission, and particularly crowding and movement. So in New York City, they identified that crowded trains, crowded traveling processes moved the infection from one part of a city to the next. So mobility, moving around and crowding, and lack of ventilation and space was a big issue. So they are still things we need to think about. Crowding and density are the two concepts we need to take on board too. Next slide, Nick. So let's think about whether we panic or not post-pandemic. Well, in fact, if we look at, this is a simplified version of all the literature that I've looked at over the years. If we looked at the global south of the less developed world, the UN slum habitat definition still is relevant. In those countries, we need to make sure that people have security of tenure. They have access to sanitary facilities. They have access to water. They have sufficient space, and they have durable, permanent protective housing that is not too crowded. that is still something that when we're designing cities, we need to think about. But then if we come on to what you might call the global north, more developed places, it is still reducing the sense of crowding, making people feel safe from crime, facilitating good relationships, building communities, moving about easily and now with space and ventilation, promoting physical activity and healthy diet in terms of the urban form, the planning, enabling independence in older age because we have got an aging population, designing neighborhoods for children, reducing overall stress, and in general, promoting positive moods and emotions. And it sounds simplistic, but actually, you know, the key issue is designing cities that are easy on the eye, green, clean, accessible, friendly, courteous, affordable, resilient, and sustainable. Can we do this? Let's take next slide, please. So in terms of what we can do, there has been quite a bit of work done in the last couple of years by different design consultancies thinking now about future cities, and DRMM architects were looked at what they might call multi-purpose neighborhoods. The problem they cited was the sort of monoculture, that many cities, they're drunk on the profits from the flow of construction of high-priced housing, you might say, have become monocultures of residential areas, with other areas that are large, dirty industrial areas with no-go zones where people are employed there, but they're busy in the day and they're empty at night, and the home areas are the reverse. So what are the solutions? In fact, a lot of the industry today are quiet industries. They are their technologies, their startups, their urban farms, their breweries. They don't require much ground floor access. They don't have noisy machinery, and they don't have, you know, they're not traditional factories. So what's the solution? Next slide, please, Nick. The solution might be multi-purpose neighborhoods. You know, there's been a lot of talk about 15-minute cities, most prominently by Anne Hidalgo, the mayor of Paris, who talked about the polycentric city, which means cities of little villages. And actually, I'm sitting in London, and London is a bit like that, a city of little villages where you can, you know, cycle to a walk 15 minutes from your door to anything, and therefore you don't need to travel into other parts of the city or what you might call virus-rich city centre. DRM proposed that why not stack industrial units on top of each other, enabling work and home to be in the same place, enabling us to providing jobs in one place and stacking those on top of other buildings to enable us to have swimming pools, climbing walls, you know, local attractions, greening the whole place, and giving housing developers a whole new area, enabling modern industrial units right next to housing. Or I would say, indeed, we may well also be looking at city centres like the City of London, where offices are now empty because people are working from home. And can we actually design those sort of places so that we have people living and working there, and they're less of a monoculture? So there are some ideas of where we need to think future about the urban form of not just new urban form, but existing urban form, and how we move it forward. I think, Nick, it's you to take this forward.
Yes, that's right. So post-pandemic cities by design, it's really important we understand what we mean by the future city. Infrastructure can last hundreds of years. Products and services change rapidly, and behaviour change can take moments or decades, depending on the context and the issue. So how do we take this into account? How do we establish the need for a vision of the future city in which millions of individual needs are catered for? In design terms, it's going to mean radically rethinking the boundaries of the design disciplines by considering places as almost superorganisms supporting humanity and other species, conceptualizing cities as not just containers for services, but also for the provision of life support throughout our life course. This kind of rethinking is going to prove challenging, not least for designers who will need to draw on additional expertise from a range and diverse set of disciplines and professions, and this will be including the life sciences and public health. Fundamental to this step change is designing the system for transparency and for the integration of places, products and services. And I would say this means including all resident stakeholders in the design process, and probably fundamentally changing the sequence of that process as it currently exists, because it doesn't work at the moment. Consultation happens too late when the decisions are made. So we need a careful balancing of urgent needs and contemporary priorities with long-term goals. I think it's also, perhaps, as we're moving through the pandemic, worth raising the idea that design should be human-centered seems increasingly ridiculous, given the anthropogenic impacts we are having on the planet. It's led to serious damage to the environment, destruction of ecosystems and habitats, various forms of pollution, putting animal lives at risk as well as ourselves, and continues to contribute to climate change. The coronavirus pandemic has brought even greater attention to the role of green and blue spaces and infrastructures for humans to flourish. The plethora of new agendas promoting health and well-being in cities, we've seen all these reports, right, over the last few years, are accompanied by visions of clean, green and daylit urban environments. But they say very little about the complexity and interdependencies of our relationship with other species. And instead, they tend to favour a rather manicured and sanitised view of nature. So I think personally, we need a radical rethink of health and well-being agendas that are more than human in their ambitions and objectives. And the work that I've been doing with colleagues at Imagination has been exploring what more than human cities might mean and how we could change deeply rooted existing practices to radically improve urban resilience amidst climate change. Rather than prioritising human needs over all other species, I think we need to recognise our position within the wider ecological systems. And this is what Rachel was talking about earlier when we're saying we're designing for human well-being, but also the well-being of the planet. Because I think that would establish very different design values than the ones we have at present, in terms of thinking about how we consider the lives that co-produce the city towards a multi-species urbanism. And it's our way of turning our attention to those elements that are often underrepresented or even excluded from design. To design future cities, I'd say there are 4 points to consider. Where are we now? Where we want to be? How we will get there? And what are the options? So first, we must establish a baseline of what is, including an understanding of what is going on in a place and levels of well-being. And we do need greater empirical evidence to challenge assumptions. For example, the links between deprivation, built environment and well-being. There's some of this research in here, as has been presented already earlier today, but there's more that needs to be done. And this will enable the refinement of correlational evidence in terms of the socio-spatial characteristics of the urban environment and how these may impact the well-being of residents. Second, we must understand the values, needs and aspirations of people to ensure that any future visions articulate their essential perspectives designed for the well-being of these people. Our processes for integrating these have to be able to deal with competing values, needs and aspirations so that we can find suitable ways of negotiating towards shared fundamental principles that form the basis of an agreement. And the who in such processes is critical to the level of social inclusion. We know that there still remains large, marginalized, underrepresented groups, those who are able to speak about the future of place and those who are disempowered to do so. Now, I think the strength of professional designers is that they can look holistically at a situation. They can diagnose and identify alternatives and opportunities, and of course, visualize future concepts. So finally, the role of designers is in the establishment of these future visions is critical, because design is a process by which we conceptualize and visualize futures, both near and far. So it's sort of world building, there's narrative creation, which other people that are not familiar with design with can work very effectively with. And although the value of these methods has been established in some academic and professional communities, we still need to bring it to the mainstream, educating designers to design futures in conjunction with all of the stakeholders to enable everyone to speculate and explore scenarios. There are tools that can help us, frameworks that set out quality of place and well-being or sustainable development, and other methods for addressing complex interdependencies. So, last slide now. Future cities for well-being by design. Designers and design decision makers, by which I mean all members of communities, whether professional, elected or resident, should determine and undertake specific and contextually related inquiry. So aspirations, energy, mobility and food consumption in relation to well-being and public health. But to implement any of these plans, we need a process of leadership, and an articulation needs to be in place so that alternative voices are addressed, difficult decisions are made, and trust, which is key to most forms of action, is established to deliver the preferred outcome. This engagement with the political dynamics of a place is not an easy principle to understand or engage with, but it's going to be crucial for designers and design decision makers to do. Understanding and applying a system of design decision making that includes design informers, design decision shapers, design decision makers, and design decision takers, we have yet to take the leadership mantle. Moving design beyond the individual place, product and service, it is imperative that we now work out the way we can deliver well-being in future cities for everyone. Thank you.